Now that we have a basic understanding of the colonies and how they came to be, we actually move very quickly into the road to independence, which is the next section. So we're going to start with the relationship with Britain. In 1763, when most of these colonies have been established, the relationship with Britain is pretty satisfying for most of the colonists that are living in America. Few of them wanted actual changes in their relationship, but they did start to notice that there was a large number of British troops, and they started to be fearful that these British troops would slowly disturb their liberties. Well, in 1763, the king decides to put together the Proclamation of 1763. Essentially, he gives them a boundary. He tells the settlers that they cannot move west of the Appalachian Mountains. Now, most settlers, most of the colonists couldn't understand why is that? Why can't we settle any farther west? So they saw this as a limit on their freedom. Remember that many of them came over here because they wanted free land and they wanted the opportunity to expand. At the same time as Britain is limiting the colonists, Britain also needs something from the colonists. Britain had a huge amount of debt from fighting the French and Indian Wars that took place. And what they really saw was that the American colonies were a new source of income, a new source of revenue. So they decided to start taxing the colonies. It was much easier to tax the colonies because they were a long ways from the king and from Parliament. And they had no representation in Parliament to stop the king or Parliament from imposing these taxes. So the first tax that was put in place was the Sugar Act, passed in 1764, and its main job was to prevent the black market between the colonies and the West Indies. It lowered, I know, sounds interesting, it lowered the tax on molasses that was imported by the colonists. And the hope really was to collect more money because more of the colonists would start buying this imported molasses instead of trying to go illegally behind the backs of the British. They felt as though the people of the colonies would be more responsible and lawful, and therefore it would increase the amount of money that they made off of taxes of imported molasses. They also established special courts to hear specific smuggling cases. Now, the big issue is that all of these judges were appointed by the king. So we can start to get an idea of how the king's rule is impacting colonists. In response to the Sugar Act, a gentleman by the name of James Otis said very bluntly, "Taxation without representation is tyranny." He said, essentially, only the colonists have the ability to tax themselves because colonists could not vote for members of Parliament. They had no representation. Only people that were represented could be taxed upon. Now, James Otis begins this revolution only with the Sugar Act, but it really didn't take hold. In 1765, the Stamp Act was passed. Again, it's a tax on almost everything that was printed. For instance, a newspaper, a pamphlet, a will to say, give property when you were dead to your family, playing cards, anything that was a printed material was taxed. During this time period, birth certificates stopped being created for a while because there's a tax on it. There's a tax on marriage license, on death certificates. A lot of this stuff just stops appearing because of the tax. There was a lot of protest to the Stamp Act. Once again, Parliament had interfered in colonial affairs, and they had passed this tax without the consent of the colonists. People at the second tax that was put in place started to get even more upset. The argument was only colonial governments could pass a tax. Patrick Henry, who we're going to talk about a little bit later, persuaded the House of Burgesses in Virginia to take action against this Stamp Act. He wanted it to be written down and passed by the House of Burgesses that only they could impose taxes because there was actually representation. Samuel Adams went even farther. Samuel Adams, who was related to the president, John Adams, would be president one day, John Adams, not the beer guy. Samuel Adams started the Sons of Liberty in Boston, Massachusetts, in which they burned effigies of tax collectors, symbols, actual mannequins and models of tax collectors. They destroyed houses, and they marched through the streets shouting that only Americans had the right to tax. Now, the Sons of Liberty were a little bit out of control with all of this, but the point had to be made, not going to be taxed for no reason. In colonial cities across America, people began to refuse to use these stamps. They boycotted British and European goods. The boycott spread so much that merchants begged Parliament to repeal the Stamp Act. Business owners begged for the Stamp Act to disappear. So, what happens? You'll have to tune in to Unit 2, Section 2. Right now you need to take the quiz.